The night wind swept through the empty street as the streetlights cast a dim yellowish glow onto the cold cement ground. At the corner of the street, a dark figure stood in silence. A wild German shepherd. Its fur was unkempt, covered in dust and dirt. Its bright brown eyes gleamed in the darkness, as if waiting for something. The locals had started to notice it, because it always came back here. Every evening, precisely at 7 o'clock, it would appear in the same spot. It never begged for food, never howled, just stood there, quietly staring in one direction. Some people tried offering it food, but it never ate. It just stood there, waiting. But waiting for what? No one knew. No one dared to get too close. Until one night, Daniel decided to uncover the mystery. Daniel stood from a distance, watching the dog. Tonight was no different. Exactly at 7 p.m. it appeared. It didn't wander, didn't search for food, didn't bark, just stood still at the street corner, like a living statue. Its eyes were fixed on some distant place, as if waiting for someone to return. Daniel felt that something was off. A stray dog wouldn't behave like this. A thought flashed through his mind. It was trying to signal something. Tonight, Daniel decided to follow it. He pressed himself against the corner of a building, patiently observing. Time passed slowly. Then, just as always, after about 10 minutes, the dog began to move. It didn't roam aimlessly, but walked with purpose, heading out of the city. Daniel took a deep breath and quietly followed. The street gradually sank into darkness, the streetlights fading as he ventured deeper into the outskirts. The dog didn't seem to know someone was following it. Or maybe it did. It was just waiting for someone brave enough to follow. And tonight, that person was Daniel. Daniel quickened his pace, keeping close enough not to lose sight of the dog. It moved with clear purpose, never stopping to sniff around like other strays. This wasn't normal. The farther he went, the city lights faded behind him, giving way to cold, silent roads. The wind whistled through the bare, lifeless trees, carrying a chilling sensation. Ahead, the dog turned onto a narrow path leading into the forest. Daniel hesitated for a moment. Inside, the woods were pitch black. "Damn it! Where are you going?" he whispered. But he didn't stop. He followed, his footsteps sinking into the scattered dry leaves on the ground. The wind picked up, branches creaking like unseen hands, beckoning him forward. The dog kept moving, unfazed. It knew exactly where it was going. Daniel swallowed hard, his heart pounding, as he saw what lay ahead. A chill ran down Daniel's spine as he stepped deeper into the forest. Darkness swallowed everything, with only faint moonlight filtering through the barren branches. Ahead, the dog suddenly stopped. It looked around, ears perked, as if listening for something. Daniel held his breath, watching, and then a faint sound broke the silence, a weak groan, barely audible beneath the howling wind. Daniel blinked, straining to hear. This time, it was clearer. It was a human voice. Someone was here. Daniel took a step forward, but the dog immediately turned back, letting out a low growl. Not as a warning, but because it wanted him to follow the right path. Daniel swallowed hard, his heart pounding, as the dog darted into the undergrowth, leading the way. Seconds later, he saw it. An elderly man, lying at the bottom of a steep slope, barely able to move. His hands trembled, his faded eyes filled with despair. Daniel froze. This was why the dog had returned to the same street corner every night. It had been trying to call for help all this time. And now, someone had finally listened. Daniel rushed down the slope, his shoes slipping on the damp, decayed leaves as he neared the old man. "Can you hear me?" Daniel called out, but the man only let out a weak groan. The dog stood right beside him, whimpering softly, its eyes filled with concern. Daniel knelt down, feeling the cold radiating from the man's body. His hands trembled, his skin was pale. He had clearly been exposed to the elements for too long. "I'm going to get you out of here. Don't worry." Daniel's eyes scanned the area. The slope was steep, surrounded by jagged rocks and uneven ground. Getting the man back up without a rope would be dangerous. He bit his lip, his mind racing. If the man stayed here any longer, his body would deteriorate beyond recovery. But if Daniel tried to carry him up alone, without help, he could put both of them at risk. The dog remained by the old man's side, its eyes locked onto Daniel, urging him to act. "I got it, buddy," Daniel murmured, taking a deep breath. He pulled out his phone. No signal. This was too dangerous. He had to handle it himself. Daniel slipped his arms under the old man's shoulders, trying to lift him slightly to check for any serious injuries. "Can you move your legs?" he asked. The man let out a faint groan, his eyelids fluttering open, his breathing shallow and unsteady. Very weak, but still conscious. Daniel gritted his teeth, using all his strength to lift him, but the man's weight and ice-cold body made it incredibly difficult to move him. The dog circled them anxiously. Then, suddenly, it grabbed Daniel's sleeve and tugged firmly. Daniel stared down in surprise. It was trying to help him pull the man. "Really, buddy?" The dog let out a low growl, its eyes filled with determination. Daniel took a deep breath and nodded. "All right, let's do this together." Daniel tightened his grip, using every ounce of strength to lift the old man. His body was ice cold, almost lifeless, but Daniel couldn't give up. The dog still held onto his sleeve, pulling in sync with his movements. "Good job, buddy," Daniel murmured, his feet slipping on the damp mud. Every step felt like carrying lead, but he kept going. His muscles screamed in exhaustion, but he clenched his teeth and pushed forward. 1 step, 2 steps. The icy wind howled louder, but they were almost at the top. Daniel tightened his grip on the man's coat, gave one final pull, and then, finally, all 3 of them reached solid ground. He collapsed, gasping for breath, his heart pounding in his chest. The dog panted heavily beside him, but its eyes shone with relief. They had done it. But it wasn't over yet. The old man still hadn't woken up. Daniel knelt down, placing his fingers on the old man's neck. His pulse was still there, but dangerously weak. There was no time to waste. He took off his jacket and draped it over the man, before turning to the dog. "Listen, buddy, you brought me here, but now I need you to do one more thing." The dog looked up at him, ears perked, waiting. Daniel pointed toward the main road. "Run back to town. Find someone, anyone." The dog didn't move right away. It glanced at the old man, then back at Daniel, as if it didn't want to leave. "Go," Daniel said, louder this time. This was no time for hesitation. The dog hesitated for just a second, then suddenly turned and bolted, vanishing into the darkness like an arrow. Daniel could only hope that someone would come in time. He knelt beside the old man, gripping his shoulder, his voice steady and warm. "Hold on, sir. Help is on the way." But would it be soon enough? Daniel knelt beside the old man, gripping his hand tightly to share his warmth. He was still breathing, but it was dangerously weak. "Hold on. Just a little longer." Daniel glanced toward the dark road, hoping. Would the dog find someone in time? The wind howled louder, its icy gusts cutting through him. He could feel the mud and snow seeping through his clothes, but stopping wasn't an option. The old man wouldn't last much longer. Daniel squeezed his hand, gently shaking him. "Sir, can you hear me?" No response. He clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stay calm, but the worry was creeping in. And then, a sound echoed through the night. Barking. Shadow. Daniel's head shot up, a flicker of hope lighting his eyes. Footsteps pounded against the frozen ground. And then, flashing lights from an approaching car pierced the darkness. Help had arrived. The car skidded to a stop beside them, and two men jumped out. One of them ran straight toward Daniel, his eyes widening in shock. "Oh my God, Mr. Parker?" Daniel blinked. "You know him?" The man nodded, quickly kneeling beside the old man. "He's been missing for 3 days. His family has been searching everywhere for him." A chill ran down Daniel's spine. 3 days? He turned to the dog. That was why it had returned to the same street corner every night. It wasn't a stray. It was a loyal friend, desperately seeking help for its owner. Daniel felt his chest tighten. How could a dog be this faithful? Mr. Parker was rushed to the hospital that very night. The doctors said that if help had come any later, he might not have survived. Daniel stood outside the hospital room, watching through the glass. The dog lay at the foot of the bed, refusing to leave, not even for a second. Mr. Parker opened his eyes, his frail hand reaching down to gently stroke the dog's head. "You never gave up on me," he whispered. Daniel smiled softly. Sometimes heroes don't wear capes. They have 4 legs, a loyal heart, and a love that nothing can break. Daniel stood silently outside the glass window, watching the hospital room where Mr. Parker was slowly recovering. The doctors had said that if help had come just 1 night later, he might not have survived. The dog hadn't left his side. It lay beside the hospital bed, its chin resting on Mr. Parker's leg, its deep brown eyes never straying from its owner. Exhausted but alert, it watched over him, guarding each breath he took. Daniel felt something stir inside him, something stronger than loyalty, unconditional love, a promise the dog had taken upon itself. It had waited, night after night, through the bitter cold, just to find someone who could save him. And now, with its owner finally safe, it remained by his side, a silent protector. The doctor stepped out of the room, gently pulling the door shut behind him. Daniel looked up, curiosity in his eyes. "Is he going to be okay?" The doctor nodded with a sigh. He was severely dehydrated, and his body temperature had dropped dangerously low. "But there's something remarkable." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "What is it?" The doctor smiled, glancing toward the dog. "If it weren't for him, I'm not sure Mr. Parker would have lasted this long." Daniel looked through the glass window. The dog had its eyes closed, but it still lay pressed against the old man's legs. The doctor continued, speaking softly. "A dog's body temperature is higher than a human's. On the first night, when Mr. Parker was still conscious, this dog used its own body heat to keep him warm. It never left his side, not even for a moment." A shiver ran down Daniel's spine. It hadn't just gone searching for help. It had fought alongside Mr. Parker, doing everything it could to keep him alive. The doctor exhaled. Not everyone would do that, you know? An animal willing to sacrifice itself for its owner, even when it was on the brink of death, too. Daniel smiled softly, his eyes shining. Not an animal, a friend. 3 days later, the snow had begun to melt slightly, signaling the arrival of spring. Daniel returned to the hospital, carrying some food and a cup of hot coffee. As he stepped into the room, the sight before him brought a smile to his face. Mr. Parker was awake, propped up against his pillows, gratitude shining in his eyes. And at his feet, the loyal dog still lay there, a silent guardian. Daniel walked closer, setting the bag of food on the table. "How are you feeling?" Mr. Parker gave a faint smile, his hand gently stroking the dog's fur. "I never thought I'd live to see the sunlight again." Daniel nodded slowly, his gaze shifting to the dog. It had been through so much over the past few days, yet its eyes still held unwavering vigilance and devotion. It hadn't left its owner's side for even a moment. And then, Daniel realized something. It wasn't just Mr. Parker who needed this dog. The dog needed him too. "Can you tell me about him?" Daniel asked, curiosity in his eyes. Mr. Parker hesitated for a moment, then gently stroked the dog's ear, his voice warm and steady. "His name is Max. I adopted him when he was just a little pup." Daniel glanced at the dog. "And yet, he was loyal enough to risk his life to save you." Mr. Parker chuckled softly, his gaze distant. "Max has never left my side, no matter where I go. But I made a mistake." Daniel tilted his head. "Mistake?" Mr. Parker sighed, his eyes heavy with memories. 3 days ago, I went outside to gather some firewood, but it was too cold, and I slipped, falling down that slope. My leg got trapped, and I couldn't climb back up." Daniel nodded slightly, picturing the scene in his mind. "So Max stayed with you the whole time?" Mr. Parker smiled with quiet pride. "Not just that. He tried to keep me warm, and when he realized I was getting weaker, he left to find help. Every night, he returned to that street corner, waiting for someone kind enough to follow him." Daniel felt his throat tighten. Max wasn't a stray. He was a loyal friend, a silent hero, and he never gave up. Daniel sat in silence for a moment, reflecting on everything Mr. Parker had just shared. He looked at Max, no longer just a stray dog. He was a warrior, a friend who had devoted his entire being to protecting his owner. Mr. Parker gently placed a hand on Max's back, his voice slightly hoarse. "I owe him my life." Daniel nodded slowly. "What do you plan to do next?" Mr. Parker fell into deep thought before letting out a quiet sigh. "I'm old now. I don't know if I have the strength to take care of him anymore. But I don't want to be without him." Daniel could hear the hesitation in his voice. It was clear that Mr. Parker loved Max deeply, but he also understood that his life wasn't the same as before. And then, an idea sparked in Daniel's mind. "Mr. Parker," Daniel began, his voice slow but resolute, "if you'd like, I can help take care of Max with you." Mr. Parker looked up, surprised. Daniel gave a gentle smile. "I can never replace you, but I think Max needs both of us. He's spent his whole life protecting you. Now it's time for someone to protect him." Max lifted his eyes, as if he understood every word Daniel said. He didn't want to leave Mr. Parker, but he could also sense that there was someone else willing to protect him too. Mr. Parker smiled, a look of relief in his eyes. "You really want to do this?" Daniel nodded firmly. "Yes, a loyal dog like Max deserves a home and a happy life." A few days later, Mr. Parker was discharged from the hospital. Daniel helped him return home, fixing things up to make it easier for him to move around. Max stepped inside first, trotting around as if inspecting everything. But then, he stopped in front of the fireplace, looking at Mr. Parker. He knew he was home. Daniel smiled, kneeling down to pat Max's head. "Well, buddy, now you've got 2 people to take care of you." For the first time since Daniel had met him, Max wagged his tail. He had finally found what he had been waiting for. Max was never a stray. He was a loyal friend, a silent hero. Even when the cold threatened to take his life, Max never gave up. He returned to the same street corner every night, clinging to the fragile hope that someone would hear his call for help. And in the end, a miracle happened. Perhaps in life, we have all met a friend like Max, someone who never abandons us, even in the hardest of times. If this story touched your heart, leave a comment below. Do you believe in the unwavering loyalty of animals? And if you want to share meaningful stories like this, don't forget to hit like and subscribe, because somewhere out there, another Max may still be waiting for someone to listen.